Welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to be talking about movement and overall activity and answering the question of how many steps in a day you should actually take, because the age-old idea about 10,000 steps doesn't really add up when you look at how the body works and how you should be managing your energy effectively. So when we talk about how many calories you burn and how many steps you take, what we're really talking about is physical activity. And there's a few different pieces of this equation we want to start with. So first, before we even get to the workout, you're going to burn a certain amount of calories just being active and moving around. So these are calories and steps that just come from general activity, and this is a big piece of the puzzle because you're going to be moving around for a lot more hours a day than you're going to be working out. Now we also, of course, want to add in the training piece of this because that is going to burn a good number of calories, particularly in your higher intensity, higher volume days in metamorphosis. And conditioning in general is going to require a higher level of activity and a higher overall calorie burn than something like strength because of the nature of conditioning training. Now, the other pieces we have to consider is what we call movement efficiency. We talked about that earlier, but again, the more efficiently you move, the lower your cost of movement from the energy standpoint. So if you were able to train very efficiently in your movement patterns, your technique is very good, you will burn fewer calories and take less energy to do the same thing than if you were less efficient in your movement. So this equation, basically, it's your overall activity level plus your training, so non-training and training, times your movement efficiency. That's going to give you basically your total caloric expenditure for the day, aside from the basic metabolic stuff we talked about earlier. But that leads us to another question, right? How I talked about in the last lesson, your body can only produce so much energy in a day because of the constraints in metabolism, and it's not this unending supply of energy. But the question then is, well, how many calories can I burn in a day? What is my metabolism capable of? And we can answer that, or at least get some really good clues, by looking at a paper that Dr. Herman Ponzer, I mentioned last lesson, looked at how many calories people burn in extreme endurance events across a wide range of distances and types of events. So without digging too deep in the science, basically what he found is that the longer you go in any sort of endurance type quest, the more your calories start to become constrained to a particular level. And through his research, he basically found that this equals to about 2.5 times your basic metabolic rate. Now you might see BMR and RNR interchanged. One's basic metabolic rate, one's resting metabolic rate. For all intents and purposes, they're both measuring essentially how many calories you're burning in a resting state throughout the day. But the way the tests are administered is a little bit different. Basic metabolic rate is typically measured first thing in the morning, before you've had any food, after fasting, all these sorts of things. And resting metabolic rate tests can be administered any time of the day you may have had some food. So they're a bit less strict conditions. But generally speaking, these numbers are trying to get to the same thing. So whether you see BMR or RMR, they're within 10% of each other. And the reality is none of these are 100% accurate to begin with, because they're really just measuring your metabolism at one point in time and then extrapolate that across 24 hours. But there's good research to suggest now that that number slightly changes. Your metabolic rate does not stay fixed across 24 hours. So regardless, the whole point here is that if we look across longer distances, basically longer periods of time, we find that your body cannot produce more than about 2.5 times that basic metabolic rate per day. Now, it doesn't mean you can't exceed that in short periods of time. Like I get that question, what about marathons? Yes, you can exceed that limit in short periods of time. If you look on the left side of the graph there, actually both of them there, you can see in different events that are very short-lived, you can produce much higher than that. But again, this is about sustainability. So we can use that 2.5 times our BMR to answer the question of basically how many steps we should take. But again, because steps aren't all created equal, what we really want to look at is calories and energy expenditure to figure out those steps. Because again, the steps in a workout are going to be different in terms of the energy requirements than just walking around. So that brings us to basically how do we calculate that? And the best way to do that is what's called the Mifflin-St. Jeor equation, or if you really want to dial things in, you can go get a laboratory test done. But the Mifflin-St. Jeor equation has been shown to be, generally speaking, the most accurate equations are out there for this. You simply need your height, your weight, your gender, and your age. You can just punch it into a formula, and I'll include a link to an example of where you can do that. And boom, it spits out your BMR. So at the time of this video, I'm 210 pounds, about 6'2", and 42 years old. So my BMR, according to the equation, is right around 1924. So That means my metabolic ceiling, in other words, the most amount of calories I could burn a day on a sustained basis. Now, of course, again, I could do more than that for a day or two, or maybe even a week, maybe, but over time, I'm not going to be able to sustain that. So my metabolic ceiling is about 4,830 calories roughly per day. So I really don't want to hit that every day because I'm not likely to have a whole lot of calories left over for recovery if I'm going right up to my limit. So in general, we want to use this range of somewhere between about 1.8 and 2.2 times that BMR for a daily caloric guide. And again, your steps are going to be different total in that range depending on what you're actually doing for them. So for me, that gives me somewhere between 3,463 calories up to about 4,232. Now again, these are exact numbers, but the science is not exact here. So 4,100 calories versus 4,200 calories is a pretty immeasurable difference in terms of what you're actually going to feel or notice. So you're just trying to get close enough. You're trying to understand the ranges that you should fall within. So again, if I'm doing a lot of training, that leaves less energy for general activity. My steps should be lower to accommodate for that. If I'm doing a whole lot of physical activity throughout the day, well, then I've got less of a pool of calories left to expend during my training. So we want to keep this in mind, and this also comes back to nutrition, which we'll talk to next. But this gives us just guidelines to understand how many calories and how many steps as a result of that we want to be shooting for each day in order to make sure we have enough left over for recovery. Now, the other thing to consider here is just overall trackers. Okay, so we want to make sure we're tracking our activity and making sure that we have some gauge. And the best way to do that these days is with an activity tracker. So the first thing is that most trackers, I would say, are relatively comparable when it comes to tracking daily steps. There's not a massive difference in accuracy from what you're going to see from an Apple Watch to Oura or Garmin. They're going to be all fairly close in terms of their accuracy in the daily steps. They don't have to be 100% accurate to be still valuable for you. Now, where they become much less accurate, on the other hand, is in the caloric expenditure thing, which sucks because, like I just mentioned, you really want to have an idea of your calorie expenditure more than just the steps. But the reality is these can vary widely. The calorie expenditure should be considered just an estimation, and if you're using one of the better brands, you're probably going to get a little bit better estimation than a lesser known brand. But in general, measuring calorie expenditure based on a wrist-based device or even chest straps is a messy business, and the science shows us there can be a really big variance from being mostly accurate to being basically junk and worthless. So be aware of what device you're using. And again, the goal here is just to have a range, and it's going to give you some good idea of the range of calories you burned in a day, and that's going to be helpful for making sure that you are in, again, the right general range, and just you have this awareness. And the biggest thing I can tell you from looking at this stuff is a lot of times people aren't aware of their daily steps versus their workout calories, and understanding that those two add together, they can't be considered totally separate. And that's the biggest thing to recognize here. So if you're extremely active throughout the day and then you have a high intensity development red type day unplanned, you have to be aware that that's going to put more stress in the system and leave less overall energy available for recovery. So we want to consider those two things as two parts of the whole rather than two separate things entirely. And then really when it comes to choosing these activity trackers, because again, they are mostly going to be comparable in terms of the activity, just find something that is comfortable, has a good battery life, you like the way it looks, because it is something to get accurate numbers you do have to wear all the time. And that's ultimately going to be probably a good decision of which one to buy versus trying to buy the most accurate activity tracker. Now, the other thing is I don't personally like wearing stuff all day. So my phone tracks activity. There's my steps for last week or so, or a couple weeks ago. So if you don't want to wear an activity tracker, you have either an Android or you have a Apple Watch phone, you can just set those to track your activity. The Google Fit and the Apple Health will just track your phone's activity. Now, again, it's not perfect because your phone's probably not always with you, but it does give you a general guideline to at least work from. And again, its goal should be to build awareness for how active you are throughout the day and then help you plan more effectively your training strategies as you progress through metamorphosis. So that should give you some idea and general guidelines in terms of how many steps you should take in a day, and that's how many calories you expend. So next up, we'll talk about how should we eat to make sure that we are finding the right balance between caloric expenditure and caloric intake to, again, fuel recovery and our conditioning.